And back now for some analysis of all of what we've been talking about this morning. David Sanger is the national security correspondent for the New York Times. Christi Parsons, we welcome her for her first appearance on Face the Nation. She covers the White House for the Los Angeles Times and all the other Tribune newspapers. And Ruth Marcus, columnist for the Washington Post. David, let me start with you. The president's speech.
Well, I thought it was interesting for what it said, and I thought it was interesting for what it didn't say. He certainly addressed, Bob, the most critical political issue, which was the one of whether or not this bulk collection of telephone numbers that you've been discussing throughout the show should be moved from government hands to private hands. He said yes on that. Whether or not there should always be a warrant or some kind of court order to query it, he said yes on that. He said no on something that the FBI had pushed back on hard. There was a recommendation from that group that Mr. Morell was on that said that if there's ever a national security letter issued, and there are thousands issued by the FBI all the time, they should also have a judge pass on those. The president rejected that one. What he didn't talk about, Bob, were the issues that were of most concern in some ways to American companies and to the NSA, which was a recommendation that the NSA not regularly weaken the encryption systems that are used to protect all of our data, what goes to Target, our health data, and so forth. The NSA has weakened those over the time so they could break into them. And also a recommendation that the NSA get some additional supervision when they're looking at weaknesses in software so that they could do cyber attacks on other countries. And on those, the president's still studying it.
Christi, you've been covering President Obama for a long time. Is this a different President Obama or a different Barack Obama than the Obama who came to office talking, was pretty critical of some of these
Yeah,
agencies?
he was, and that's what people remember when they think about the Barack Obama who ran for president. He was critical of the Bush wireless warrantless wiretaps, for example, there was the line from his 2004 speech about feds, raiding the libraries and so forth. But the fact is that when he's been in office, he actually has been more open to programs like this. For example, he voted to reauthorize the Patriot Act. People forget about that. And he's been open to things like the drone program and this kind of surveillance. The thing that we see time and again is that he really does approach these things like a lawyer. He can get to the point where he's comfortable with programs like this, but he wants to run it through his process. He wants to see rules and checks and balances, and he wants to do a public explanation.
Ruth, I thought you had a really interesting column when you talked about the two kinds of loyalty, talking about Bob Gates and then talking about this whole issue. Where did you come down on the president's speech?
On the president's speech, I came down slightly more positive, I think, in terms of the impact than David did. I would call it significant but incomplete, but with an emphasis on the significant. I think the biggest change is something that Mike Morell mentioned, that the president has now said we will have judges, not bureaucrats at NSA, no matter how well-meaning they are. There's 22 folks at NSA now who have the authority to query this database, but they have a self-interest. They see things from a particular perspective. I would rather have federal judges helping oversee and make this decision. That is a huge change, and I think it's a very important one.
And tell me a little bit about that, what you had to say about Bob Gates in there.
Well, I wrote a little bit about loyalty, and one of my big concerns, and look, all of us in the news gathering business love inside information, so it's a little churlish of us to be criticizing people who give us inside information. That said, I do think, particularly with Secretary Gates, a Republican brought into a Democratic administration, not in a sort of sideline position, but in a really critical policy-making job, to then turn around and write his memoirs while the president is still in office, really would, if I were a president, selecting a candidate in the future would give me pause about selecting somebody from the opposite party. Loyalty is a underappreciated virtue in Washington these days.
I tell you what I found interesting about it. Much of the criticism that Mr. Gates made, I happen to agree with. But I thought making the criticism at this point, while the president is still a sitting president, I was very surprised that Bob Gates did that, because you talk about loyalty. I think there's a certain loyalty to the presidency. And I think when you make it harder for a president while he is still in office, I think I have problems with that. If he'd have said it after the president left office, but maybe he thought it was important enough that it ought to be said now, and obviously he did.
That's his argument, and I was at a breakfast with him on Friday where he reaffirmed that he didn't feel that he had transgressed issues of loyalty. I just have to respectfully disagree for exactly the reasons that you said. Not while you're in office.
David, what about Mike Rogers talking this morning about the Russians may have had a hand in helping Edward Snowden make some of this information public, and both he and Mike Morrell said it goes back to the idea of what kind of information he was releasing. What was your take on that?
Well, there's a lot we don't know yet about whether or not Edward Snowden was operating independently, whether this was his idea as a protest about what the NSA is doing, or whether or not he was operating on instructions from someone else or decided later on to cooperate with someone else. But certainly there are a lot of issues about whether or not China and Russia obtained the information out of computers he was traveling with when he showed up in Hong Kong and then again in Russia, and then whether he struck any kind of deal for his stay in Russia. And we don't know. We also don't know how much information he's actually in possession of now, or how much he may have left others in possession of. Clearly, everything that we've heard suggests that the intelligence agencies are worried more about what may come than what has already out. I wrote a little bit this week about some documents that were published in Europe a few weeks ago that showed how the agency uses radio wave technology to get into computers that are completely separated from the internet. We published this because the information had already appeared in European papers, and so had the documents. But certainly the NSA has got to be worried about how many more of their techniques are out there.
Christi, what are you hearing at the White House? Or is there concern there about the safety of America's athletes going to these Olympics?
You know, I haven't heard people talk about that an awful lot, to tell you the truth. The focus for the last couple of weeks really has, the White House has been so consumed with containing the fallout from the Snowden revelations, for example, and so much of the focus has been on preparing these reforms that the president talked about on Friday. I haven't heard them talking about that yet.
They also have Congress back in town, and they're going to have plenty on their plate there. What's going to happen, Ruth?
Oh, I think it's a safe bet to say not very much, because, one of the most vivid parts of the Gates book were the string of adjectives he unleashed on the dysfunctional Congress, and it's hard to disagree with that. Congress only deals with action-forcing events. So eventually the authorities of the Patriot Act, for example, to get to the NSA issue, are going to expire, and there is going to have to be a decision about whether to reaffirm those. But it's going to be very hard to see really substantive change from this Congress unless there is a deadline bearing down on them, and perhaps not even then. The next really big deadline we're going to have to deal with is the debt ceiling, and already you can see the jockeying on that. There, I hope they've learned their lesson and will blink well before the event.
Worth saying that the Patriot Act doesn't expire until 2015, which
yes.
takes you past the midterm elections. But at that moment, it really is going to be fascinating to see, because Congress is going to have to make some decisions on all of these positions the president's taken, and several he hasn't taken, because the alternative will be that the entire Patriot Act would just expire.
Well, that's why the president's approach to Congress this week, to me, seemed like something we're going to see an awful lot more of, which is he proposes some changes, he describes the situation, makes the case for change, and then kind of kicks it over to Congress and says, let's see what you folks can do.
Here's the problem, what makes me, when he turned it over to the Congress to write the stimulus package that first time around, that didn't work out so well, and I'm not sure Congress is capable of doing something like that. And that's, to me, where the concern is.
Absolutely. Our constitutional architecture wants to put a lot of these policy-making decisions in the hands of lawmakers, but they haven't proven themselves capable of doing the policy. That leaves it to the other branches of government, which is not healthy for democracy.
On the other hand, in this case, for some of these changes with the NSA, which I think the president feels beaten upon, for all the reasons Mr. Morrell said, this is a way of slow walking some of the changes. He can appear to embrace some big, broader changes, but say, look, this requires congressional action, full in the knowledge that Congress is not exactly going to leap to the task.
Right, but you're undervaluing what he did when you say appear to embrace some changes, because I do think, once again, that the question of judicial involvement in querying these huge databases, which is going to happen with or without congressional
that's the biggest
action,
single change.
is a big deal.
Well, and he also did set some changes in motion, for example, by requiring the judicial review before querying the database. No one's obligated to continue doing that, except that now it's being done. If no great calamity comes as a result of it, that may have actual effect, whether, regardless of how common.
The other thing is, and this is kind of inside baseball, but I think it's very important, the president has really bolstered up his congressional team. I mean, he's put in a new congressional relations guy, a new White House lobbyist on Capitol Hill. People outside of Washington say, oh, come on, that's not a big deal. It's a very big deal because, I had Democrats and Republicans coming up to me last year saying they didn't know who the president's chief lobbyist on Capitol Hill was. I mean, they'd never seen the person, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful to the person, but his lobbying effort, his ties to Capitol Hill were just almost non-existent.
But Bob, the president's chief lobbyist on Capitol Hill needs to be the president. And
of course
there's really a big question about how much effort he wants to put into that, and at this stage, how big an impact that can have, because relations are frayed both with Republicans and Democrats.
But I think you're right. I couldn't agree more on that. But it has to be face-to-face, one-on-one congressional relations, not just going on television and making a speech and expecting everybody to fall into line. So,
well, it's been interesting to hear the White House talking about Congress being one element of their strategy going forward, apparently somewhat equal with the pen and the phone that the president appears to have acquired.
Those are the three branches of government.
There they are.
all right. Well, I think we'll stop it right there. Thank you all very much. It's fun to talk this morning. Back in a moment with our Face the Nation flashback.